Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna discuss about a subject which I've been asked many times in the past, and recently there was a comment asking me what I think about it, and as the title suggests, we're gonna talk about potting orchids in general with other houseplants we might want to keep together. Now, I'll start the video by saying that as an orchid collector, orchid grower, and enthusiast, I will always say it is a bad idea. But in reality, we all can do whatever we want, whatever appeals to us, whatever we think will be nice for us. However, all of the things we do have consequences, and we can have good consequences and bad consequences. Now, of course, we all want to have success, but sometimes it's kind of hard to foresee the bad consequences of something, and particularly when it comes to potting orchids in the same pot. We all know that we can find in flower shops those arrangements that come with some plants and then an orchid in the middle, or a few orchids, and they're all potted in this bowl with who knows what inside. And typically those things end in disaster. It doesn't mean that the idea doesn't work, it just means the execution was done very poorly. So, do I believe orchids can be grown with other plants? Yes, and I'm also going to give you some examples. They might not be what you expect, but for the main part, do take it with a grain of salt. I am an orchid enthusiast, lover, and collector. I mainly grow orchids because I like orchids. I don't necessarily like arrangements. So I'll give you today my perspective and why I believe it's not such a good idea, just so you know the consequences, because if you're creative enough to overcome the consequences, well, that would be great. Here are the problems that will occur when you try to pot orchids together with other houseplants. First of all, the medium. We will have an incompatibility between the medium orchids like and other plants like in the vast majority of cases, and this is because the vast majority of orchids we're growing are epiphytic plants, meaning they don't grow in soils. You could call them air plants because they grow attached to trees, to branches, everything that is above the soil. So things like Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, Oncidiums, pretty much almost everything you can find at the flower shop is an epiphytic plant. And pretty much everything else that you can find at the flower shop is a terrestrial plant. So from the get-go, you will have an incompatibility regarding media. Orchids will prefer something very airy, in some cases quite chunky, while other plants will not like this. And of course, depending on the medium, on your environment, how you arrange your setup, you can have orchids doing okay in a particular setup and the plants just dying off. And P.S. this root, can you respect privacy, please? The opposite can happen as well. If you will go for a medium which benefits the houseplant, but not so much the orchid, you will have a pretty unhappy orchid. And again, depending on the species you can have more or less issues. It's gonna be a hassle sometimes to juggle between the preferences of the two, and pretty much this incompatibility of their core nature makes them just incompatible in general to be grown together. Now, I know that in flower shops you might see houseplants that are terrestrials together with orchids looking beautiful. The orchid is in bloom, the plant is happy, the leaves are green. Well, most of these arrangements are prepared in flower shops. The distributors or providers don't ship them as such in the vast majority of cases. They are arranged like that after the flower shop receives them, and in many cases, the problem of epiphytic versus terrestrial is not really a concern for flower shops. Also, orchids are slow to react. They're slow growers, their roots are slow growing as well, and until they become unhappy and suffocated, quite a bit of time will pass. So you can get an arrangement from the flower shop with different plants, they all look great, and they might still look great for a week or two, and maybe in the third week or fourth week you will notice some things happening, some things that are not good. And that's typically when we all start to Google it and we discover the big mistake that has been created, the incompatibility between the orchid used and the other plant. plant. Now, buying these arrangements is not necessarily wrong because you can absolutely separate the orchids and the plants. There are other things that make them incompatible if we disregard the medium, and one of those things is watering. There are some plants which prefer to stay very, very moist, and there are some orchids which don't really necessarily like it all that much, particularly in a suffocating medium, such as soil or even sphagnum moss. Now, depending on environment, some orchids will stay wet all of the time and will be perfectly fine, but this doesn't apply to all environments. So when you want to water, let's say, the other plant which starts to wilt, the orchid might not need water. So if you frequently water your pot just because the other plant is wilting, you might actually overwater the orchid. And again, this applies a lot to organic medium, not necessarily inorganic, and of course it depends on environment. But there is such a thing as overwatering an orchid in some cases. So in trying to maintain the other plants hydrated, you might actually suffocate the roots of the orchid. Water is a pretty crucial element or feature in caring for an orchid, and there is so much to be said that I'm not gonna go into. Bottom line, there is a very, very big incompatibility between epiphytic orchids adjusted to a lot of air movement and terrestrial plants which like a more fine compacted soil. Another incompatibility between orchids and other plants is fertilizer. Orchids generally, no matter if they're terrestrials or epiphytic, they have much slower growth than other houseplants. There might be exceptions, but not all that many in flower shops. So when it comes to fertilizing, houseplants do require more fertilizer because they grow faster. They produce more structures in a shorter amount of time. Orchids, be it terrestrial or epiphytic, have much slower growth. So you will fertilize to feed the other plant, but for an orchid, it might actually be a little bit too much. And even if you think that the other plant will use up the fertilizer, you don't know if that will happen. You don't know how the fertilizer will be dispersed in the pot. Maybe in one corner of the pot where the orchid is, we don't have roots of the other plant. So the fertilizer will just be there. It will create leaf tip or leaf burns. The remaining salts can create root burns and so on and so forth. Never a good idea to over-fertilize orchids, so that's another very important thing to consider. And the list can actually continue. Temperature, humidity, light quantity. These requirements can be very different for orchids in regards to other plants. And depending on what we try to grow together, we might give too much or too little light, or too low temperatures or too high temperatures, and so on and so forth. And if we have an orchid which takes dormancy and does not need any type of water during winter time, but the plant does, then that's a recipe for disaster. And there might be other things that I'm missing right now, but basically, culture-wise, orchids in the vast majority of cases are just so incredibly different than any other plant that they are purely incompatible. You can definitely grow an orchid next to a plant in different pots, and I'll actually show you an example. There you go, you might actually know that I have a few carnivorous plants, so definitely you can grow them together because you can find terrestrial plants which have the same temperature, light, humidity requirements, but they have different medium requirements. In the case of carnivorous plants, these guys don't like fertilizer. It is very difficult to properly fertilize such a plant, and in many cases it's really not needed because these plants take all the nutrients they need from whatever insects they catch. And also they do not like high salt quantity in their water. So these types of carnivorous plants should be watered with very, very pure water, no fertilizer at all, and they should never, ever, ever be allowed to dry out, or else this will happen. You'll have a lot of dieback on the plant if it is allowed to just dry out. Now, if you would put something like this with an orchid, you can see how things will go terribly, terribly wrong. You need to fertilize the orchid. You might need the orchid to dry out a little bit between waterings, depending on what you're trying to grow. So combining this particular plant with an orchid is in most cases a very, very, very bad idea. Now, except the difference in culture needs, there are other things we need to consider. Let's say we find a plant that takes the same medium, same watering, same light, same everything as our orchid. It means we can grow them together in a pot, right? Yes, but There's also the risk of cross-contamination. And I know it sounds dramatic, but it's true. Whenever we place together two plants, be them two orchids or an orchid and something else, there is a chance that one of them contains a pathogen which it carries, but it doesn't manifest. Now, if we put this plant together with a weaker plant that catches the pathogen and it cannot hold it under control, it will start to take over the plant. So we might actually lose one of the plants simply because the other plant had a pathogen we didn't know about. And things don't really end here. Since they're going to share everything, they will actually share everything, including pests. If one of the plants has pests, you can be sure they will be transferred to the other plant as well. And speaking about things we cannot see, how about fighting for survival in the given space? There is such a thing when it comes to plants. In their adaptation for survival, some plants have developed a sort of mechanism to repel other plants from their presence. Now, I personally don't know of specific names, but I will try to Google it and share with you in the description any article that I find on the matter. But there is a chance that by combining an orchid with a plant, one of them will start to repel the other, and it will simply make life a little bit harder for the other plant. I'm not sure if orchids are capable to do this. I think terrestrial orchids usually do this. But even if this doesn't happen, let's just think about the space in the pot for their roots. Usually houseplants create a much more elaborate and vast root system. If the plant starts to take over the pot, the orchid might run out of space to put her roots. And even if they do have space in the same pot, maybe the plant will just suck up all of the moisture and nutrients so fast that the orchid will starve. Or you might think you are watering the plants properly, but one of them will just become dehydrated because the other one is more competitive. Then from an aesthetical point of view, you can combine an orchid which looks in a certain way at some point with a plant that looks in a certain way at that point as well. And you might have the surprise that in 2 months or 3 months, one of the plants has grown so much that it's shading the other, or it doesn't let it put out its leaves properly. It pretty much hinders its development. And I will take a wild guess and say that most other plants will grow faster than the orchids, they will shade them, they will not let them develop properly, and in the end, even from an aesthetic point of view, it will just not look pretty. And I'm guessing that if somebody is interested to make an arrangement, it is because of aesthetics or because they want to save space on the shelf. In the end, you might be able to save space for a month or two until one overgrows and you realize that the setup is not really serving its purpose anymore. So in the end, as you can see, picking orchids and plants that can go together is slightly tricky. And when you find something that can go together, there's the pathogen issue and the disease spread issue as well that you need to think about. And you need to pick two very healthy plants and you need to be sure about it. And for us, it's really important that the orchid is healthy because orchids are much more expensive than any other plant, and also because we are invested in these plants, not other plants. But as I was saying at the beginning of this video, growing orchids and another plant together is actually not impossible. It's not even detrimental either, but the associations might be something you didn't think about. So for example, here I have an orchid, a bulbophyllum, which has a top layer of some sort of moss. Now, yes, moss is not a houseplant necessarily, but it is a plant. And this is not sphagnum moss or anything, it's just a little bit of moss this orchid had on top of its medium when I purchased it. So I harvested the moss, I didn't throw it away. I repotted my orchid, as you can see, it is in my sphagnum moss setup with bark on top. And the moss is actually compatible with this plant. Moss likes moisture, it hates too much fertilizer, just like this plant actually. So they are compatible between them, they don't hinder each other. The moss will just create a little carpet on top. It doesn't even suffocate the roots because it's a very fluffy moss, it's not like algae. And they can coexist together perfectly. Now, of course, there's always a chance that disease might get spread, but this moss already came with the orchid. So chances are that both of the plants are okay with each other. If there's something to be shared, it has already been shared probably years ago when this cohabitation happened. So in this case, obviously, the moss can absolutely be grown with this plant, and actually beds of moss are really frequent in the hobby for those orchids that require to be rather moist. They don't like a lot of fertilizer, they don't like heat, they don't like a lot of sun, pretty much everything the moss hates as well. Bulbophyllums generally are grown with moss, also masdevallias, other terrestrials as well, which typically stay more moist and don't require a lot of fertilizer. They can all be grown with a bed of moss on top. Now this moss, I'm not sure what it is, but some people actually use live sphagnum moss with their orchids or with their carnivorous plants. Sphagnum moss, I feel, is a little bit more finicky than what I have here, especially with a high salt content, but just so you know, some orchids can actually be grown in live sphagnum moss. Another plant that can also be grown with orchids is the tillandsia, also known as the air plant. And there are various varieties of this air plant. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. Not all of them will be compatible with orchids for various reasons, but one which is fairly used, particularly with vandas, is the so-called Spanish moss, which you can see here. I managed to obtain a little bit from a flower shop. It's not looking all that hot, mine, I have to say. It wasn't in very good condition, but this is an air plant which does not have roots. It doesn't stick to anything. It just continues to grow leaves on and on and on. And what they do is actually get wet and soak up water whenever you water the orchid, and then they can dry. Being that they're air plants, they like a lot of air, just like vandas, and many people grow them as a sort of top layer for orchids. In some cases it works, in others it doesn't work all that well, depending on environment and setup, but definitely they can be grown together. Of course, passing disease is still an issue. That's why when you have something like this, you try it out with 1 or 2 orchids if the orchid didn't come with it already, or you try to buy it from a reputable grower. So it's a personal choice here. But definitely air plants, at least some of them, can be grown with orchids more for decorative reasons than anything else. And because they are both air plants and epiphytic plants, they do go together most of the times. And the last thing that maybe you really didn't think about is growing an orchid with a tree together. How do we do this? Well, we mount the orchid on the tree. This is pretty much how orchids grow in nature. They are not parasitic plants. They don't feed on the sap of the tree. They just attach to the bark. So if you live in one of those climates which does not have a very harsh winter, moreover, you might have some orchids native in your area, you can definitely grow orchids attached to trees usually, or other plants, be them palm trees or other bushes, let's say, that can accommodate a little orchid. You can absolutely do that, and I guess that can be considered as growing both of the plants together, because the tree will only be a support, yes, but you can definitely care for the orchid separately than the tree. So with that said, I hope this video was useful for you guys. As I was saying, I'm talking from the perspective of the orchid collector and lover. I treasure orchids above everything else at this point, right? Because this is the collection. And if I am to buy a different houseplant, I do prefer to keep it separate. I am in the hobby not for the design, but for the growing aspect of things. So with that said, it's really up to you. I hope this video will help you decide and help you think about things you might have not thought about before. And in the end, thanks for suggesting. It was an interesting topic, actually. And you know the drill. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on notifications for my channel. Also, if you're interested in my setup, what products I use, fertilizers, lights, and so on, I do list them in the description. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!